Well, friends, it's my honor and privilege to introduce the second of our two now and then conversations, which will be a conversation about teaching the Bible. Our conversation partners, Dr. Carolyn Pressler and Dr. Sena, are both prominent scholars and beloved professors of the Hebrew Bible. Reverend Dr. Pressler is the Professor Emerita of Biblical Interpretation at United. A leading feminist biblical scholar, Dr. Pressler specializes primarily in gender and biblical law. She is the author or editor of several volumes, including an outstanding commentary on the Book of Numbers, everybody's favorite book of the Bible, and an introductory textbook entitled Engaging the Bible in a Gendered World, an Introduction to Feminist Biblical Interpretation. Dr. Sena is the director of the Spencer Library and associate professor of theological bibliography at United. Dr. Sena also teaches courses on the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and biblical hermeneutics. His doctoral dissertation at Marquette University focused on Ecclesiastes and its ancient Near Eastern influences. He has also published a number of essays and articles on biblical interpretation, Pentecostalism and race, and theological librarianship. Besides their scholarship on the Hebrew Bible, Dr. Pressler and Dr. Sena also share a deep passion for teaching. Dr. Pressler's classes on the Hebrew Bible are legendary. Yes. I have good days. Among the many things I admire about Professor Pressler is her willingness to truly learn from her students and her absolute refusal to rest on her laurels. She worked tirelessly to update and improve her courses, even in the final years of her teaching career. And Dr. Sena is following in her footsteps. Just last week, one of our wonderful graduates told me that Dr. Sena was her favorite professor, and then she apologized. Indeed, both Dr. Pressler and Dr. Sena are extraordinarily gifted teachers, committed to engaging, innovative, inclusive, democratic, and liberative pedagogy. The impact they have had on the lives and ministries of their students is truly incalculable. Drs. Pressler and Sena will be discussing the following questions. 1, who are the 2 or 3 scholars who have most influenced your work? 2, are there any scholars you've left behind who are no longer relevant or helpful to your scholarship and teaching? And 3, how have you been changed by your students? Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Pressler and Dr. Sena.
Do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. First off, I want to thank you for having me here. I'm still getting used to being the then, but retirement's real nice, so I think I'll get used to it. I also want to thank Cindy Beth for the questions, because I found, as I was reflecting on who has influenced my teaching, who has influenced my scholarship, there were just so many, and I was overwhelmed with gratitude for the people who have shaped me. And some of them, especially Clyde Steckel, Sue Ebbers, Cindy Beth Johnson, and Wilson Yates, and I better quit naming because there's too many, are here, and I cannot adequately express my gratitude. If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a metropolitan area to raise a biblical scholar or teacher. It's hard to name just 2 or 3 who have affected my teaching. My work has done 2 prongs, and I'm going to talk about the teaching, and I always have considered myself a teacher of the church through the classroom, through my commentaries and a lot of my articles, and through teaching in church settings. And you can tell I'm from a prior generation. If I did it now, I'd have to say I'm a teacher of communities. And in fact, even when I was teaching, there were far, far more than church people. I had Muslims and Jews and UUs and Wiccans and Baha'i, and sometimes in the same class, and that made for an interesting mix. Boy, I remember one class, I spent the first 6 weeks trying to get people not to be afraid of each other, and the next 8 weeks I just sort of said, okay, let's start. And then, oh, it's 9 o'clock, we have to go. And they taught each other. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the influences on me as a teacher of the communities. And there's so many. I borrowed from James Barr, a 20th century biblical theologian who talked about the Bible spiraling in and out of history. I borrowed from Victor Furnish, a New Testament scholar who did a wonderful archetypical or typological view of authority, which I loved because he went from fundamentalist to post-Christian, but with respect of every category and looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each position. And I thought, that's what I want to do in my classroom. I want Republicans and libertarians and socialists and Democrats all to feel welcome. That was tough at United. Walter Brueggemann. I mean, how many people here have not read Walter Brueggemann? He and Christy Nuger convinced me of the importance of imagination in biblical interpretation. His book, Prophetic Imagination, I read in seminary, and it's one of the hooks that got me into biblical studies. And I ended up using his the Canon and Christian Imagination as the textbook for my classes for the last few years, because it was the only book I could find that I thought really dealt with the critical introductory issues that need to be addressed, while also teaching for what difference does this make for your own faith, whatever your faith may be, including atheism, but what difference does it make? And it was a blessing to have. But the two who influenced me the most, and I don't know, maybe I should have moved on. Rich Weiss always said, you know, you're stuck at Princeton. But the 2 people who influenced my teaching and my thinking the most were my doctoral professors, the 2 lead ones, Patrick Miller and Catherine Sackenfeld. And they influenced me not only because of the foundational character of doctoral studies, but because they were so darn good at it, and because they bring lenses to their work that are the lenses that I care about. Pat is unfortunately died a couple years ago, but he had been in Southern Carolina, I believe. He was a young pastor during the civil rights movement of the 60s, and he was willing to risk his job and his family's well-being by coming out in support of the civil rights movement publicly and publishing. That's courage. He later was on the Inclusive Language Lectionary Committee, and he and other friends of mine carried cards in their wallets that told people who to contact on the FBI if they were murdered, because they were getting so many life threats, letters threatening their lives or the lives of their families, for having dared to translate words like anthropos, man and woman. I mean, that's what it means. But apparently this is not good. So he has a strong social justice view. He had a passion for literature and looked at the texts as what's keen eye. Others were, at the time he was studying, others were investigating the sitz and leben of the different forms and trying to reconstruct history. He was working on what are the poetics of the Psalms? How do they function as poetry? And I still recommend chapter 3 of Interpreting the Psalms as the most accessible discussion of poetry that I've in the Hebrew Bible that I know. Kathy was a feminist and of the first generation of feminists. While everyone else was telling me to read with as much objectivity and to let this text ask the questions, let the questions you ask come from the text, Kathy said, no, you can bring your own questions. Just be very disciplined about it. Everybody else is bringing their own questions. They're just not saying so. And she taught courses like, this may sound familiar to you, Liberating Word, Feminist Approaches to the Bible, and that influenced me a lot. Kathy emphasized context and that where we come from matters and how we interpret, and it's responsible to say how. They're both historical critics, and I was reading through my lectures in preparation for this. I thought I better know what I did. You know, it's been a while since I retired. And I was like, oh my gosh, I cite people who are so old, like Hermann Gunkel and von Rad and all these people. I mean, historical criticism is so last week. But knowing when the texts, when they were written and why, it makes them pop. And so I never quit doing that, even though it's sort of, I don't know, do you use historical criticism?
All the time.
Oh, good. Yay, that makes me happy. We're both last week. And the other thing about Kathy and Pat that I am so glad is true also about President Marshall and President Dean, friend, father figure, Wilson Yates. They not only taught biblical theology and Bible, but they lived the faith, and they lived it humbly. Pat was probably the premier professor at Princeton when I was there. He was the only one, when they moved the president from one house to another, they asked him to move into the president's house because they couldn't think of anyone else who would move into it that wouldn't cause controversy. And he taught second grade Bible in his church. And he asked me to help nudge him towards clearer understanding of women's rights in the Bible. I was a first-year student, a second-year student. Dear God. Anyway, I hope that that passion for the church and for justice and for art and for love of students, I hope that that informed my own teaching too, but that's what Pat and Kathy were all about. How about you, Mr. Tim?
So yeah, it was a tough question, I thought, because like you, all the names that you mentioned are influences for me as well. Historical critical methodology is kind of where you have to start when it comes to the Bible, and I started to think about the same or similar names and started to create this list. And then I realized something about that, and you kind of alluded to it, and while it's important, it's also kind of old in a way, because it's where we have to start. And yet I realized as I was thinking about my teaching, my biggest influences today are my students. Because they're asking the questions. And so what you are talking about with asking the questions, I realized they were my influences because they're the ones that ask the questions that shape the way that I teach. And so when the good questions come, and in a place here like United that is so wonderfully diverse, and we do have all of those voices, both Christian and Jewish and every other kind of perspective, I realized to try to teach simply a historical critical methodology, which I do, and you have to do that, is not the place I start. I start with, where are the students at? What are the questions that the students are asking? And I realize that has influenced my teaching in ways, as I was thinking about this question, I hadn't even realized how much it influences my teaching and my scholarship and the way I approach the text, because they're the ones that, in a sense, at a place like United, they're the ones that matter. And so I think I'm going to, my students will laugh and say, Tim, whenever we ask you a question, you never answer the question, you change the question and answer something else, which is a good teaching technique, I think.
And stretch it so far that we can't, but yeah.
And so I'm doing that by saying, I think that my influences primarily are my students, and they're the ones that have shaped my scholarship and my teaching more than anything else.
We were asked what we had left behind, and then we were asked, how did our students influence us? And I think that's maybe why I didn't talk about how my students have influenced me. That and the fact I gave an entire lecture on it already, which is online if you want to look at it. But you're right. You have to meet people where they're at. And it is wonderful how the diverse... Kathy had grounded me in the understanding that there will be diverse interpretations, that there is no one interpretation, because interpretation of the scriptures is dialogical. And so who we are as we come to the text determines what questions we ask, what data we notice, how we put it together, and then what we do with it. I think the historical critical stuff is because in a dialogue there's two partners, and the other partner are the ancient voices, and we ask all the historical critical questions like, what's this form? What source is it from? What was the existential issue that they were facing? All that stuff is in order to be respectful of the other voice in the dialogue. So I guess there's a bunch of voices. There's the voices in the canon, of which there are too many to count. There's the voices in the students that we're teaching, and then there's trying to be aware of our own voice and what's shaped that. And I do want at some point to say a little bit about how students have shaped me, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to ask you, I don't know what your main research has been, and I'm really interested in knowing more about who you are as a biblical explorer.
Well, maybe just to add before I answer that question, I think that one of the things I've noticed with students today is that those ancient voices are often muted in our study, and we don't give the voices themselves their proper space. And that often, because Bible, of course, is one of those really challenging things to teach, because it's rare to have a student, or anyone for that matter, who comes to the Bible without some sense of what it is. Whether it's something that's oppressive or liberative or something else, almost everyone comes to the text with some sense of what it is. And so I find that trying to bring the voices of the ancients out in their context and allowing them to speak for themselves is often quite challenging. And so those are the voices too that I think, as you were talking about, those are the voices that we try to bring out in the class. And sometimes we're successful, and then sometimes my own bias gets in the way and I'm less successful with that. Scholarship that I'm doing today, I'm right now kind of working on two different projects that are actually not very similar at all. One of the projects I've been working on forever, and it's one of those projects that who knows if it'll ever get done, but working on some commentary work, but doing it through the lens of especially Buddhism, and reading wisdom literature through Buddhist lenses and through Buddhist concepts, because part of my heritage is South Asian, and looking to see how has the wisdom tradition of other parts of the world both impacted the way we read the text in the past, but also in its current context. And a lot of the wisdom traditions in the Hebrew Bible are very, they have that Eastern feel to them. They're coming from that part of the world. And so what influences and what pieces of that can we draw out of the text by taking that lens on purposely and then going to the text with that? So that's one thing I've been working on. The other is part of my background, my sort of journey in life, is that I grew up in a very fundamentalist evangelical context, and some of the biblical interpretational methods that I received are very well, you have one possible interpretation. So instead of the multiple options, there's one right answer. And one of the things I've been working on is not so much criticizing that approach, though that needs to happen, but there have been lots and lots of scholars who have done that. But looking at what are some of the logical end results of that. And one of the logical end results of that is white supremacy. The model, the method is rooted in white supremacist readings. And so what happens is when we talk about the other, for example, so if you're reading about Joshua and the conquest, and you're reading it through those methods, all of a sudden the other, it's okay to kill them. It's okay to destroy them. It's okay to do whatever to them. And in our current context, all of a sudden it's okay to do the same things when you read it through that method. And so often we criticize the method, and we should. I mean, we should bring that out, but we don't talk about, if you accept this method, this is the logical outcoming. That's why there are lots of people and lots of churches in this country right now who can very easily say, the immigrants, they have no business being here. The foreigner, we don't want them, because their biblical interpretation models allow for that kind of interpretation. So I'm writing on how, bringing that out as sort of a logical conclusion, so then we can, of course, critique it.
That's wonderful. And it's also so ironic because, as you all know, if you've studied here, the Hebrew Bible came out of the place where the Africa and Asia come together. It's from the Afro-Asiatic context. It's not from European. We're grafted on, my ancestors. And it is Asian, and it is African. And it's also ironic, although it's quite understandable, that the story of Joshua is so used to justify, the doctrine of discovery and things of that sort. But in fact, it was a legend of origin to support the battered peoples. I would place it at least right before the Babylonian conquest and decisively edited after. So they were the minority, indigenous, battered people, much more like the Dakota than the Europeans. And that's where historical criticism really helps. It's just, how do you get people to know that, and how do you communicate it quickly and easily? It's difficult. But your work, that sounds so exciting. Shall I tell them about my own research, or is
Yes,
that...
I was just going to say, you were telling me right before about one of the projects you're working on. That's very exciting.
I don't remember what I told him, but what I've mostly worked on since 1988 is gender and biblical law. And that's a little misnomer, because Pentateuchal law isn't really law, it's legal theory. And some of the cases may be from the elders. It's certainly not a comprehensive code. I mean, it talks about what to do if a woman's husband divorces her and then she marries somebody else and then he divorces her or dies and then the first one wants to remarry her. It talks about that, but it never establishes how a marriage happens, and it never establishes what divorce is and whether that's allowed and how that happens. So it's philosophy or social political ideals. And I worked with gender. I told Pat Miller I wanted to do my dissertation on Deuteronomy and gender. Deuteronomy and women, that's what I said. Women in Deuteronomy. And he said, oh no, I want you to do it on women and biblical law in general. Well, I ended up doing it on women and 1/5 of Deuteronomy, some 30 verses. And then I discovered there is no category woman in Pentateuchal law. To use Kimberly Crenshaw's brilliant insight into intersectionality, gender intersects with marital status, with generation, whether you're the mother or the daughter, and with class, especially whether you're a free woman or a free propertied woman or a woman whose husband or father is enslaved. Now, what females have in common is that their status is going to be defined in terms of their relationship to the man who has authority over them, except for people who are widowed or prostituted women or impoverished women who are without a male-headed household, and they're the very marginal ones. But the statuses of women differ widely based on what role they play, how it intersects with those things I said. The other distinction I had to make rather quickly was that between subordinate status and property. The only women who are, or girls who are property in the Pentateuchal laws are those who are enslaved. And even there's clearly going on that they're both human and property. Like if their tooth is knocked out or their eye is busted, they get to be freed. If they're Hebrews. I'm not sure that was true of non-Hebrews. It ended up being so much more complicated than gender and law, or women in law, that I thought I was going to be, that it took me, instead of just for my dissertation, it took me the rest of the 30 years that I was teaching to keep teasing out and teasing out and teasing out what I could learn about the ideals of different circles and different places, and then by kind of looking underneath them to see what cultural contexts had to be in order for there to be such a law. To get a little bit more at what they might have been living. It's a teeny bit of biblical scholarship, but it's my own.
I was actually talking about, you have done some work on ecology as well.
Oh, that's what I'm doing now.
Yeah, tell us about that. That's
okay.
Interesting as well.
Well, I'm just starting to do that. My sister, by other parents, Reverend Dr. Alika Galloway, who I've been working with at Northside Healing Space for some 12 or 15 years, and who co-taught. I have never had such powerful experiences teaching as co-teaching with her. She is just so energetic. And so we did feminist, womanist, queer approaches to the Bible, which we called Interpretation as Resistance. And it was amazingly fun. But she called me a month or two ago and said, I want you to work with me. I've been asked to teach on environmental racism. And I'm like, I don't know much about that. I want you to do Genesis 1 and 2. And it turned out what she wants me to do is to deconstruct the way it's been massively misused, subdue the earth. Well, those people had just been defeated in battle and had gone to, there were no more than 11,000 of them living in Yehud at the time, and the crops had been burned, and they were no more able to screw up the ecology than they were able to confront and defeat Babylon. I mean, it wasn't addressed to us. Moreover, they were supposed to subdue the earth as what? The image of God. And while there's a lot of debate over what that means, what it probably, I find most persuasive theory, is that to be the image of God is to be like those stela that were put at the different edges of the empire because the emperor couldn't go everywhere, and so he'd cause, or she, there were a few she's, especially in Egypt, they'd cause images of themselves to be put out there to say this is where God rules. So if we are to be the image of God, we are to treat the earth in such a way that anyone who sees us and our actions will know that the God of justice, love, and shalom rules here. And you can't destroy the earth and be the image of God. That's what we were talking about. Sorry, Tim.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. Should we talk about students a little bit?
I'd love that. You go.
All right. So I was thinking about students in my classes, and one of the things I think that's really fascinating about, even in my time of teaching, that I've noticed that students have changed a lot, is that students come into my classes with a sense that the Bible is a very oppressive thing, that it is something to fight against often, and that there's a real question, and it's an honest question. It's not a bad question at all. It's an honest question of, do I even need to deal with this anymore? And the other piece that I find really interesting is that my students often are very trauma informed. And so they understand the inner workings of how this thing called the Bible has been used in oppressive ways, not only in communities, but towards themselves. And so I often find that the first few weeks of class, we do some strange sort of trauma-informed, psychological, how do we approach this text as a person? And we have to kind of clear some space for that before we can actually do some of the historical critical work and open up the possibility for conversation, simply because the students who are coming in are often in that space of sometimes real hurt. And how do we take this thing that now often, and even then, has always been used as a battering ram, but in very different ways today, how do we create space to have conversation about that are safe, that the place is safe, the space is safe to do that? And so that's one of the things I've noticed that in my classes we do a lot of.
Yeah, and I would say that that's probably even more true than it was when I was teaching, but I only quit teaching 2.5 years ago. So, and we've always had a strong number of LGBTQ plus folk who have been Bibled and battered. I think that, well, it helps that I'm a lesbian, because it sort of helps. I can identify with that to a certain extent. But it also is the case that I've had students that assume, therefore, I'm going to take their side on any question because I'm one of them, and it's like, not quite. But we also have students who come in, especially students from, say, Liberty Community Church, for whom the Bible is absolutely a lifeline. And it is life-giving. And to creating the space to negotiate both of those and to create some openness where let's see what actually comes out of this when we talk is necessary. And I actually started by having each student, my first class, for the last few years at least, I had each student write down what words come to my mind when I say Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and then we share it. And then I want to spend the rest of the hour talking about that, but I don't. I talk about it as the story of ancient Israel, that in some ways is so far distant from us that we cannot fathom it. And in some ways is so influential still that we also cannot fathom it because we can't see it because it's so influential. So I talk about needing to create distance and then needing to listen. And I talk about that for me it has authority in that it's able to provide lenses for me to see the holy and language for me to talk about it in my community. That's its living authority, but that I don't expect that from everybody else. But that I hope that they will listen to it to at least get a sense of what were the existential crises and questions that the communities were dealing with then, and how might they address, where's their common existential crisis or question, like pluralism after during the Persian period when it was so fragmented and so many different people able to negotiate it, how might we identify with that crisis and how might we negotiate it? Is there anything to learn from it? Or are they just simply even if there's only what's the word I want? A horrid example that we want to avoid. What can we learn from it one way or another? I approached it like that a lot. Is that true, Mary Kay? Okay, I had to check someone who'd been my student. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think I find myself doing very similar things when I teach the prophets. And we talk about Amos, for example, and talk about the community that Amos was a part of and how in many ways that community has a lot of similarities to our current United States community, where there's that income disparity and there are the people who are incredibly rich and most of the people who are disadvantaged in different ways, and the message that Amos brings to that community and how it's not a one-to-one. I'm always adamant about we're not going to do that kind of exegetical work, but at the same time, the message of Amos still rings very true in our community today.
And one of the things, I used to go and give lectures or presentations and discussions on why the Bible is worth studying even for atheists and agnostics. And I would start with clips from Martin Luther King Jr. and say, you can't understand what he was saying without some sense of what the Bible is. And you need to know the damages that the Bible has done in our culture too. And you can't do that without some sort of Bible defense instruction.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago in class, we had a very long conversation about how the current conversation about choice and abortion is influenced in this culture community by particular ways of reading the Bible. And talking about how when you want to take a progressive role, you still need to understand how the conservative voices are reading those texts, because you have to be conversant. Whether you like that or not, whether it makes you frustrated or angry or not, unless you're willing to speak that language, you're not going to get a seat at the table often.
Yeah, and I am not willing to cede, C-E-D-E, I'm not willing to cede the Hebrew Bible or the Newer Testament to the conservatives, because I think that it's Christian nationalist reading is, and not all conservatives are Christian nationalists, I understand that, but I am very concerned with the anti-biblical, biblical interpretation that's going on these days, and I'm not willing to cede the scriptures over. When I was in seminary, my last week of my first class, which was Intro to Hebrew Bible with Bruce Birch, the last 2 weeks I dreamed my way through the Bible from Abraham and Sarah to Ezra and Nehemiah, and I ended that several dreams a night, and I ended the series of dream school, is what I called it, one of the non-Israelite, non-Judean women who had been divorced because of Ezra's insistence. and I was on a hill with the wind streaming through my hair, screaming, "I am an Israelite woman! I am an Israelite woman!" And at that moment, I knew this book, this story, it's my story. It's a long way from me, but it is my story. And I'm not giving it up to nobody. Let's see if there's any questions from, are there any questions from y'all? Yes, Dr. Steckel.
Thank you.
Yeah, just be sure to wait for the microphone before you ask your question so the Zoomers can hear.
Now I've forgotten my question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My question is to both of you. I would appreciate your speaking to the question of how you teach historical critical methodology when it itself is grounded in a culture of science and reason, which culture also is guilty of both dominating and colonizing.
And I know there are those who say the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and they have a point. But I also remember that it was Gobler, wasn't it, who came up with, in the midst of religious wars, historical critical approaches to the Bible emerged from an intense desire for peace, that if we could just look at it this way, as drawing on the Enlightenment and so on and so forth, there's no time to trace this out, and I don't know it anyway. But Gobler in the 18th century was adamant that we had to look at the general themes of the book and let it emerge, and he had the idea that if we could do that rather than approaching it through the doctrine and the dogma, that we might be able to enact peace. There were religious wars going on, and his desire was for peace. So I liked to bring up that, yes, it had all these trappings, and there was also a liberative and shalom impulse within it. I also find it useful to locate texts within their context, to look at what was going on at the time, so that we can be aware that those who wrote Joshua were writing it as a people who were themselves oppressed. In other words, I like to use it, the master's tools, to dismantle the master's house. Now, whether that's possible or not, it's how I was able to work, and it's what I was taught. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who want to go jump over the source critical and form critical and tradition history work, and I don't actually do that kind of work, but I draw on the ones of people who did it, and I find it marvelously liberative.
I think a couple other things, I totally agree with that. That is also my approach. A couple of the other things that I find is that I hold history a little bit looser. So I'm not modernist enough to believe that we can get a history, but rather there are multiple histories that we look at. And then the other piece that I find myself often doing these days with historical critical work is to not only allow the historian to speak, but the sociologist and the psychologist and some of the other social sciences, and allow those voices to come into as well, into the conversation as well. So when we talk about marginalized people, for example, we can do the historical work of trying to understand as best we can. Oh, this is a group of 10 or 12,000 people living on the hillside, and they certainly couldn't have conquered this group. But then also to ask, what does sociology teach us or psychology teach us about what those people probably were like? What might they have been experiencing? What might their lives have been like to be in a community like that? And of course, some of that is guesswork. Some of it is hypothetical. Some of it is creative. But that's that holding history loosely, because then we don't have to come to the history, but we can offer a bigger picture of these are some possibilities. And that then takes away the power, I think, of what you're talking about, where there was a history that this, white male person back in the 1940s decided this is the way it was. We can depower that by allowing for a broader, more loosely held history with other voices.
I totally agree. And in fact, one of the ways we did it, I think we both have done, is I would present 2 or 3 or 4 reconstructions of how Israel got in its land, or 2 or 3 or 4 readings of, not 2, because then you've got a dualism, but 3 or 4 readings of what was it to be a woman in Persian period Yehud, and to emphasize that we can't come up with the answer, but what we can come up with is an extremely disciplined answer from our particular perspective, and we acknowledge the particularity of it. And that I'm really emphatic that we not lose the discipline approach, even as we acknowledge the tentativeness of anything we have to say.
My students sometimes get frustrated at me. I think frustrated is the right word, when I say that oftentimes it's not trying to figure out what the Bible says. Often, we want to do that as well, but sometimes it's more important to know what the Bible doesn't say and take away options. And so history can often inform us of this cannot possibly be an interpretation of this text. And that in itself gives us space to better understand the text.
Yeah. I'm not going to go into examples of how we did that, but because it would insult some people I like a lot. But I used to present different views of like Sarah and Hagar, and okay, I'll give an example without saying the name. There was one who called it the Ishmael presence. Genesis 16, when Hagar is pregnant, she hasn't given birth yet, and labeled it, entitled it in the commentary, the Ishmael presence. Ishmael is a fetus. Ishmael isn't born yet. There is no Ishmael presence. So you can see, and that's a good way of seeing how social location impacts perception. And yet that commentary also saw things that the others don't. So you can play all kinds of games. Are we even coming close to answering your question?
Almost.
Okay. Want to try again?
Some other questions?
I have a much easier one.
Oh, good.
When you talk about literary criticism in dealing with Scripture, often there's the language that the literature renders a character. And when you think about the contested conversation about whether Scripture renders a violent or a non-violent God, what do you do with that? Now, the supersessionist way of dealing with that is the violent God of the Hebrew Bible, and then it's all resolved in the nonviolence of the New Testament. How do you all approach the question of the rendered character of God and the pluriformity of renderings?
That's an easier question.
How I did approach it, we always spent at least one session, 1 week, on Joshua and war and violence in the Bible. And I would start out with, I'd get them discussing it, and they were all pacifists at that point. And then I would play Sweet Honey in the Rocks, Sojourner Truth's Battle Hymn, which in its first iteration, when Sojourner Truth, if she is, some others have said some men in Alabama wrote it, but anyway, if it's Sojourner Truth, that she wrote it for the Michigan black militia in the Civil War who were going down to free their brothers and sisters from enslavement. And then Sweet Honey picks it up and uses it as a metaphor. And that becomes a beautiful way of talking about what's going on with the Joshua Judges stories, because it starts out as a liberation movement under Josiah and then moves to a metaphor once they're conquered. And it's a metaphor for resisting assimilation. And I don't know a Hebrew Bible teacher who has not spent a great deal of time chewing on the questions of violence and God and the Bible. But I will tell you this, in terms of supersessionist view, I'd a heck of a lot rather be killed as one on whom the ban has been laid than cast out of inner darkness to gnash my teeth forever and ever for all eternity. So I always bring that up in class too, that the New Testament is, in my opinion, more violent, or at least as violent. And I don't think I'm answering your question. I'm just saying it's a question that I have never been able to really satisfactorily answer. But what I tend to do is to get them to see there's multiple sides and none of them gets an A.
Yes. I think a couple other things that I find myself wondering is, I wonder sometimes whether the theodicy question is the right question for the text. Because I tend to take I call it a Wesleyan view of Scripture in this regard, that this is a reflection of a particular people group at a particular time, and that they aren't necessarily trying to write a philosophical treatise on theodicy. For Job being part of the wisdom literature, which is kind of an area that I work in a lot, I think reading Job as a theodicy is actually a false move. I don't think Job is interested in getting God off the hook or blaming God. Job is responding as a human to human suffering. And that's it. And Job, I don't think the book or the character Job, I don't think either actually answer the question of what to do in those contexts in terms of understanding justice. And so I kind of tend to not answer the theodicy question, which then in turn says that God as a character is many different things based on what that people group that was writing that particular section of the Hebrew Bible were feeling about God in that moment.
And there is no, it doesn't render a systematic theology or a philosophy for sure. It's funny though, because especially my early years, I tended to I was coming out of being a community organizer in inner city DC, and the theodicy questions, the questions of suffering and how do I have faith in the midst of suffering, were very, very urgent, as they are again. And in those first years, I tended to see the whole of the Bible as a massive compilation of myriad theodicies, or at least myriad reactions to how are we people of faith in the midst of acute suffering? And they came to very, very different answers. So we kind of took the opposite direction for the same reasons.
Well, and I guess when I say I don't see it as a theodicy, I mean as a single systematic theological statement, but rather, I think Gutierrez in his commentary on Job, which is not really a commentary, but an essay, where he says Job is about how to talk about God in human suffering, is exactly the right answer.
Yeah, exactly. It's one right answer.
Right.
To use your stuff. We have room for one more question.
Okay,
Yes.
so, I'm not sure if this is a question so much, but I heard earlier about trauma-informed, and one word, I mean, I guess it's a 2 words, but spiritual bypassing just came into me, and it's more of a now. I don't know then too, but how would you, let's say, would frame that, like if it comes to like students are asking about that and related to the Bible, how would you maybe explain to them, or a conversation around that, because there's that religious trauma from the Bible, and yeah, specifically the Old Testament.
You go for it.
For me, when I teach Bible and want to be trauma informed, and I'm still learning a lot about that. I'm learning about how to do that better in the classroom. So I'm by no means an expert or anything like that. To me, trauma-informed teaching of the Bible kind of has a few components to it. One is to acknowledge that the Bible has been a tool that has created trauma. There are lots of folks who would deny that, so just simply naming that and stating that is one piece. Another piece for me in my classrooms is to allow space to hold that trauma. So whether that is a student naming trauma, this verse is very triggering to me because of whatever, and whether they want to share that or not, of course, is their choice. I've had a few situations, it's rare, but a few situations where I've encouraged a student to not participate in a particular conversation in class. In our modern world of Zoom, I will often say, if you need to turn off your camera and you need to mute for a little while, that's okay. Because we want to give people, students in the case of me, we want to give space for the body to process that, space for I have control to even though I know this is a safe space, to turn it off for a second. And so to me, trauma-informed teaching and trauma-informed Bible study, exegetical work is about acknowledging the way in which the Bible impacts me, not only mentally, but physically as well. And being aware of that. And again, I'm just learning that. I'm learning how to do those things. So I don't know that I could say these are the 5 steps that you would do or anything like that. But it's just creating that space and also naming it early in the class. It's one of the first things I talk about in class is to say, I know the Bible has caused some of you trauma. That's okay. We're not here to add to that trauma. My students, they laugh about it, but it's something I hold deeply. Taking a Hebrew Bible class can be a lot of things. It should never be traumatic. And that's both sort of a joke, but it's also deeply serious, that a class should never add to the trauma. And so, there's that invitation to let's talk about that. Let's have those conversations as we go through the class and through the material.
Yes. And I found when I was teaching that to emphasize that these books came from human communities, which are a distance from us, but also like us, and that we read them as responses of different sectors and at different time periods of human communities that I happen to believe were genuinely encountered by God, but saw things through the filters of who they were as a community. And that I also think that every other human history is encountered by God. I find that response of this isn't what God said, it's what different Israelites said God said, that's helpful to people. And there's also a tremendous amount of literature coming out of the intersection of pastoral care and Hebrew Bible in general, and including work that's trauma-informed readings. Kathleen O'Connor, wonderful end of the 20th century scholar. My classmate from Princeton, Nancy Bowen, did a trauma-informed commentary on the book of Ezekiel. It's all about how that's a response to multiple responses to trauma. And I have used those materials, but I do include trigger warnings with them. And I think that signals to the students that we know they've been hurt. Yeah.
Could I slip in one more question?
Well, why don't you?
Oh my, yes. Let's talk about the hysterical Jesus at some point. But yeah, there's a lot of humor in the Bible. And one of the things I learned from Kathy and Pat is both to be passionate about it, but also to be able to step back and laugh a lot. And I think I've heard that you have that too, Tim. People have really sent love letters about your classes, so that's so good.
What a wonderful conversation. Please join me in thanking Dr. Tim Sena and Dr. Carolyn Pressler.